Hey everyone, time for our last videos of the semester. We're going to jump forward to chapter 11 and discuss a little bit more, go back, use this as a review opportunity, go back to sort of the overarching point of this class, which is this idea of the spirit of inquiry. Why is it important? And then what we're going to do today is talk about what are some things that can get in the way of it, what can interfere with it. As we've noted all semester, right, people frequently don't do inquiry great. So we've gone through some fallacies that are some examples of sort of rational mistakes that people make that can lead inquiry awry, but there's other things that can get in the way too. That's going to be our topic for today. All right, so let us get started. So way back at the beginning of the semester, we defined the sort of spirit of inquiry as sort of a drive that leads us to want to discover what's true about some matter rather than merely just winning or merely confirming what it is that we already believe. And so this is sort of an attitude of sort of investigation. And in order to do this, we said that you sort of need to have two difficult to cultivate traits. You need to have kind of open-mindedness. You need to be willing to investigate the possibility that your current beliefs are wrong. Now, that doesn't mean you have to believe that your current beliefs are wrong. You just have to be open to that as a possibility. The second of these is what we call fair-mindedness. You have to be willing to investigate seriously beliefs that disagree with your own, and as much as possible, and again, you can't do this universally, but as much as possible, try to minimize the negative effects that any biases you might possess will have upon your investigation of those beliefs. Right? It's a lot easier to fairly investigate something that you sort of already agree with than it is something that maybe you're suspicious of or skeptical of, and you need to sort of try to, as best as possible, suspend those biases to give sort of alternative views as fair a shake as possible. Now, we've noted, though, that these are very hard things to do, and very hard things for everyone to do, right? This isn't like it's hard for others, but not me or whatever, right? Like, everyone finds inquiry in some cases about some topics difficult and challenging, and it can be hard to remain open-minded, hard to remain fair-minded in certain conversations. We've seen some reasons why that might be the case when we're talking about these logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are sort of errors in our reasoning. Our claim was at the beginning of the semester that everyone takes themselves to be rational, everyone takes themselves to have good reasons for the things that they believe. And one reason why that could sort of go wrong is that if you sort of don't really have good reasons for your beliefs, but you think you do. But there's more than just rational errors or rational mistakes that can go into failures in inquiry. People can also go wrong for reasons of sort of like psychological and emotional biases, social biases, and cognitive biases. These are sort of basically features of how our brains or our minds or how our social interactions work that can make inquiry hard, that can get in the way. So what we're going to do this week is try to go through all three of those, a group of psychological biases, a group of social biases, and a group of cognitive biases. Discuss a little bit why none of these things are necessarily bad in and of themselves, but they can go wrong and they can cause inquiry to sort of fall apart. So let's start by talking about what the book calls sort of emotional or psychological biases. These are sort of, things in our sort of how we go about sort of like viewing ourselves, viewing the world, how we sort of like emotionally identify with certain things that in some cases at least could interfere with our ability to carry out an inquiry. Now remember, we said way back at the beginning of the semester, I'm going to repeat it now. The problem is not emotions themselves. Emotions can indeed be a powerful ally in inquiry by us being engaged in and caring about the topic that we're investigating. Where things go wrong isn't so much when people get emotional, it would be if sort of like emotional considerations interfered with our ability to actually investigate some piece of evidence. So the first of these biases is what the book calls ideological fixity. So let's begin just by defining what we mean by an ideology. An ideology is some sort of philosophical, religious, political, economic, there's all kinds of different things that are sort of like systems of beliefs that you sort of use to interpret the world in various ways. And this can be quite helpful, right? Having some sort of pre-existing framework that you use to evaluate the world indeed can oftentimes be really valuable. So let's just give you a couple examples of these, and there's many more we could go through. So libertarianism is a sort of economic or political belief that would be an example of one of these ideologies. Libertarianism is the view that government intervention is always or almost always bad and the wrong way of solving a problem. We can also, another example in sort of a different field, there's what's called naturalism. This is a view in philosophy that the right explanations for the world are explanations that accord with natural science, and any sort of explanation that doesn't kind of reduce to a natural science explanation is wrong or incorrect or bad. Those are examples of some ideologies. Now, ideologies themselves can be quite valuable. Indeed, maybe some of them are true. But what can make them potentially problematic from the standpoint of inquiry is that people often don't recognize that their ideological commitments are themselves things that need to be justified on the basis of evidence. Right? So we use ideologies to evaluate evidence, but how do we evaluate our ideologies themselves? And so let's say let's do the libertarianism example, right? Let's say we're engaged in some sort of political inquiry, and I'm coming at it from a libertarian perspective, from a perspective that government intervention is not going to be the right answer. That itself is a view that's going to need to be justified, though, on the basis of evidence. And if I'm too fixated on this ideological view, I might not be willing to even consider or examine evidence that doesn't agree with that ideology. So that's where it becomes sort of dangerous. That's when this becomes ideological fixity. It's where you simply dismiss or distort other views because you sort of are forcing everything to fit into an ideology that doesn't reply necessarily in what given case, or indeed maybe that the evidence actually is not supporting in some particular case. Next up, we have what gets called by psychologists the my side bias. This is just our basic tendency to be way more familiar with our position than positions we don't agree with. And again, that should make sense, right? I mean, something that I probably believe it because I've spent some time thinking about it a little bit. Where this becomes dangerous, though, is that we often simply are not aware of the arguments or evidence that someone could offer in defense of views that disagree with our own. And so this tends to cause us to sort of dismiss people who disagree with us as if they just had to be irrational, because we're just not aware of any reasons or evidence they might offer in defense of their own view. Closely related to both of those first two is a bias we're going to call the need to be right bias. This is just people just in general are really reluctant to admit that they're wrong. We like being right. No one likes being corrected or told that they were incorrect in some area. And so, this is something obviously that's going to get in the way. It's going to get in the way, in particular, of open-mindedness. We're not going to be willing to even consider or concede the possibility that we could be wrong about some view. Another, again, very closely related bias is what it's called the desire for certainty. This is where people sort of, just in general, like to feel like they have the world figured out. And this is a good thing, right? If you had to figure out everything or reinvestigate every matter every time you got up every morning, you'd never get out of the house. But if evidence is calling into question the way that you see the world, the rational thing to do is to give up our sense of certainty and sort of reinvestigate, reconsider something from the beginning. Maybe the greatest danger, or sort of what connects all of these various sort of psychological and emotional biases, is the next one, what the book calls identification with our belief. So this is the fact that human beings in general tend to formulate their sense of self and their sense of identity on the basis of the things that I believe. Right? So, let's just say, use the ideological examples that I talked about before. Let's say that I am a strong libertarian and a strong naturalist, right? That's going to be part and parcel of how I see myself and how I relate to the world. Calling those things into question, then, sort of involves giving up a sense of who and what it is that I am, who and what is important to me, who and what it is that I believe. A lot of our beliefs are really deeply important to us. They're not just things we sort of incidentally happen to believe. They're things that are really at the core of who we take ourselves to be and what we take to be important to ourselves. And so the willingness to call into question those beliefs is indeed a willingness to sort of risk oneself, to put oneself at risk. Let me give you sort of an example of this, because I think this is a really important one. So there's a member of my family, and I won't say who it is or anything, but she held really strong beliefs about abortion at one point in her life. And something happened, though. She encountered an argument she had never seen before, and she found that the argument was really compelling. That the argument that, again, doesn't matter what the side was, it's just sort of an argument that sort of changed her mind a little bit on abortion. And she found this really challenging, actually, precisely because her views about abortion were such an important part of how she sort of identified and saw herself. And indeed, to sort of the great credit of this family member of mine, she was willing to change her view anyway, even though it did indeed call into question a whole bunch of stuff, not just even personally, but maybe interpersonally. Maybe groups she was associating with or places she was going had to sort of change as the belief changed. So the willingness to sort of risk ourselves in inquiry is probably the most important and the most difficult of all of the sort of logical virtues that we can cultivate. Because people do have this tendency to associate themselves so strongly with some beliefs or many beliefs, and people have the strong need to be right in a lot of cases, people frequently interpret challenges as personal attacks. And like we were just saying, actually, in the case of identification with beliefs, in some cases, people aren't even necessarily wrong to be doing so. I mean, if my belief is formed, or my sense of self is predicated upon libertarianism being right, and libertarianism, someone suggests, is not right, they are sort of calling into question my identity in some sense. But even still, right, it's wrong to sort of read that as a direct insulting or personal sort of attack and to get defensive and just attack backwards, right? Sort of attacking in response, that's not going to advance the inquiry. What would need to be done from the standpoint of inquiry is investigating and seeing if, say, in that case, my ideological commitment really is justified or warranted in this case, or maybe in all cases. And then the last of the sort of emotional or psychological biases that can interfere with inquiry sort of relates to all of these. It's that people have a tendency to want to respond really quickly, to talk really quickly, to jump in really quickly in the course of investigating something, or in the course of responding to something that someone else has said. Almost always, our first response is not our best response. Right? It's almost always better to think about something, pause for a moment, reflect for a moment, make sure that what we're saying is right, make sure that what we're saying is sort of accurately expressing our own views, then respond in a better, more reasoned way. Someone who's going to rush to respond is so much more likely to become defensive, or much more likely just to sort of obstinately insist that they're right, or to just, be fixated on their ideology, than someone who sort of takes the time to more carefully reflect upon the issue. Alright, we'll break this video in two. The next video will cover the social and the cognitive biases that can interfere with inquiry, and then we'll talk quickly about some probably strategies we can employ to sort of avoid falling prey both to the fallacies and also to these various sorts of biases that can get in the way of inquiry.